What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Appreciate you joining me today. We are going to do a season in review, end of year recap, however you want to look at it. Before we get there, a couple quick notes from the injury report from Friday. Packers list 2 players as questionable. They're 2 big players, Keyshawn Nixon and Christian Watson. I cannot tell you, and you already know, but how important Christian Watson is to this game. I think it changes the entire dynamic of the game if he is or is not able to go. So a legitimate questionable. He will likely be a game time decision. And I don't think it's hyperbole to say that that decision and his availability could ultimately decide the Packers' fate in this game. I think he is that important. Keyshawn Nixon, no slouch either. He will be important as well for Green Bay. We're going to have to wait and see. The good news is everyone else is available. Aaron Jones, Bakhtiari, Yosh Nijman, obviously Aaron Rodgers with his knee injury, but all of them will be able to go. No injury designations at all. Just Watson and Nixon, but 2 key players for Green Bay. Meanwhile, James Lynch and Garrett Bradbury will be out for Minnesota. Those are the only 2 designations for the Vikings. So no game time decisions, no questionables, just 2 players who are out, and everyone else will be available for the Vikings this weekend. All right, that brings us to our recap, our year in review, however you want to define it. I'm going to be totally transparent with you. I have no idea how this is going to go. There is a ton to go over. It has been a crazy year. I don't know if this is going to be 5 minutes. I don't know if this is going to be 20 minutes. I will tell you, I'm going to have to do a little bit more reading in this episode because there's just a lot to go over. I haven't memorized every detail of what happened this season for the Packers, so I apologize in advance for that. But there is like I said, a lot to go over. It has been a crazy season, and I do think there's a lot of fun stuff to kind of look back on, reminisce on, and kind of just review and recap as to what kind of year the Packers actually had. So let's kick things off. January 2nd, things started amazing. A 37-10 victory over the Sean Mannion-led Minnesota Vikings. Yes, you heard that correctly. If you don't remember, Sean Mannion was filling in for the Vikings on that day, and the Packers absolutely destroyed the Vikings at Lambeau Field, 37-10. They clinched home field advantage, had a 13-3 record at that point, and everything was going swimmingly for the Green Bay Packers. We should just end the episode there because after that, things tended to get a little bit dicey for the remainder of the year, but it all started off on the right foot. From there, the Packers go into the following week. They go into Detroit. They have nothing to play for. They lose to the Lions 37-30. Kind of the big news from that game, if you remember, David Bakhtiari actually played in the game, played about 30-ish snaps, left the game, and unfortunately, that was it for David Bakhtiari for the remainder of the season. He would not be able to play in the playoffs. And that was probably the biggest takeaway from the game. The loss really didn't matter. In fact, at the time, it almost looked like a good thing because Matt LaFleur had never lost back-to-back games in his career as Packers head coach. So surely the Packers would not lose their next game in the divisional round to the San Francisco 49ers and actually lose 2 games in a row, right? Right? Well, unfortunately, that did not happen. More on that in just a moment. But we had a couple interesting things that happened over the course of the next week, or I should say 2 weeks prior to the divisional round game. The first was the huge drama. Hub Arkish, known Bears fan, Bears reporter, whatever you want to call him, decided that he was not going to vote for Aaron Rodgers for MVP, which was a whole to-do, and got a ton of flack for that. So didn't ultimately matter. Rodgers would win the MVP anyway, but the whole Hub Arkish scenario was very funny at the time, and it's still funny looking back at it to this day. Then the Packers get back Zadarius Smith, Billy Turner, Whitney Merciless, and Jair Alexander from injury prior to the 49ers game. It looked like everyone was getting healthy at the right time, and the Packers were going to be ready and set for a 49ers team, hopefully beating them and going on and advancing in the playoffs. That unfortunately was not the case. They end up losing to the 49ers in an absolutely disastrous playoff game. Rodgers struggled. The offense struggled. Mercedes Lewis has a completely uncharacteristic fumble. You have the punt block. We don't even need to go all over it. We want to start 2023 off on the right foot. You know what happened. We don't need to relive it, but a devastating loss in large part due to the special teams, but also in large part due to a offense that was basically non-existent in that game. You had the Yosh Nijman sitting out, the Rick Wagner, Billy Turner decision, all of it. It just didn't go well, unfortunately, and the Packers end up losing a huge game, which then kicked off an Aaron Rodgers saga, which was less epic, certainly, than previous season had been, but still very interesting nonetheless. And there was all the questions as to whether or not Rodgers would come back, what would happen with Davante Adams. All of those things were completely up in the air, and we just had no idea what was going to happen. Ultimately, with Rodgers, would he be traded? Would he go to Denver? Which brings us to our next topic. Nathaniel Hackett was hired as head coach of the Denver Broncos. That did not go well either. Obviously, Hackett was recently fired from his position, but that was a big move at the time, and it made two things questionable. What was going to happen to the Packers offensive coordinator position, but also, was that a precursor to Aaron Rodgers ending up with Denver? A lot of news and rumors at that time. Then the Packers promote Adam Stenavich to offensive coordinator, Luke Butkus to offensive line coach. They ultimately fire Mo Drayton, and Luke Getsy heads to Chicago as their new offensive coordinator. So lots of changes on the coaching staff. The Rams then defeated the Bengals in the Super Bowl, which officially kicked off the offseason. From there, Rich Bisaccia was hired as special teams coordinator to take over, take control of, and completely turn around the Packers special teams. Results have been better as of late. Mixed results over the course of the season. I still think on the whole, we would say a better special teams in 2022, certainly than we saw in 2021. Leroy Butler then found out he was headed to Canton. Wasn't enshrined yet, but he got the invitation and the notice that he would be one of the Hall of Fame members for the class of 2022 Pro Football Hall of Fame. From there, our first real sign that probably, or at least that Aaron Rodgers might have a really good chance of coming back, or at least a really strong olive branch from the Packers. They hire Tom Clements, his former favorite quarterbacks coach, as their new quarterbacks coach. And from there, the speculation began that maybe Rodgers would in fact be back in 2022. Then you had sort of a surprising exit. Mike Smith exits the team and ends up in Minnesota, becoming their outside linebackers coach. Then we get the official news that Aaron Rodgers would in fact be returning to the Green Bay Packers, and then signed a massive contract that really tied him to the organization potentially for 3 years. We are in all likelihood going to play out another crazy Aaron Rodgers offseason in 2023, at the beginning of 2023. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe he announces quickly that he's coming back, but there are some retirement scenarios. There's some trade scenarios. There are no release scenarios. So it's either that he's back, he's traded, or he retires, but that contract certainly makes it that he will not be released. And if he wants to stay as a member of the Green Bay Packers, he has the ability to do so with, again, a massive contract. Throughout this time period, Tom Brady retires from football, and then right at this time, he unretires from football. So just when you thought maybe Rodgers would be, the key number 12 in the NFC, Tom Brady comes right back and Rodgers comes right back. So those two just kind of always seem tied at the hip, but both of them officially are back for 2022. From there, Zadarius Smith heads to Baltimore and signs with the Ravens. Except it doesn't ultimately go through. He becomes a free agent again and ultimately signs, of course, with the Minnesota Vikings. He's had a phenomenal season, by the way, as of course he would. But he has a phenomenal season in Minnesota, but that was the time where he signed with the Ravens, and then contract situation be what it may. Some numbers issues. He ultimately signs with the Vikings, and the rest was history there. Devondre Campbell then re-signs with the Packers, fresh off his first team All-Pro in 2021. I should mention as well, at some point in there, Aaron Rodgers won his fourth MVP also. Davante Adams then was traded to the Raiders, and I remember that, sort of remember it vividly, although I was napping at the time. I remember I was set to have myself and the two kids. We were about to go to a hair appointment. Before the hair appointment, I fell asleep on the couch. I woke up on the couch with a phone full of notifications that I had not quite ever seen before, and Davante Adams had been traded. And then I'm in no man's land, because as I'm waking up, I'm supposed to take myself and the two kids to get haircuts, which is going to take up the next hour and a half of my life. And I want to talk about Davante Adams and do a live show and everything, and just had woken up from a nap. It was a nightmare, but eventually hairs were cut, and I was able to discuss Davante Adams after that. But a surprising, shocking trade. They get a first and second round pick in exchange for Davante Adams. It was a franchise tag, then signing, then trade, which is a little bit iffy at times, but they get away with it and pick up a first and second round pick in the process. But therein ended the Davante Adams era. Surprising at the time in the fact that you thought if Rodgers was going to be back, Adams was going to be back, or if Adams was going to be back, Rodgers was going to be back. And if one of them left, the other would probably left. I don't think we ever really foresaw a scenario where one of them would be back and the other would not. Yet here we were. Davante Adams was a Raider and Aaron Rodgers was in fact a Green Bay Packer. With some of that extra money left over from not having to pay Davante Adams, the Packers go out and re-sign Robert Tonyan and Rasul Douglas. Quickly after, they sign Jarron Reed and bring him on the roster. MVS then leaves for the Kansas City Chiefs. And then the Packers sign little-known free agent to a minimum deal, Keyshawn Nixon. That ended up paying off pretty darn well so far. As mentioned at the onset, hopefully he's able to play this week. He's played a massive role, not only on special teams, but as the slot corner as well. So a huge out-of-nowhere free agent signing for the Packers and Keyshawn Nixon that was literally, you could not have had a lesser-known free agent signing around the league, yet he has come in and played huge minutes and played a huge role in this Packers team. So that was a really key signing for Brian Gutekunst. Then the next one was not so key. They signed Sammy Watkins. That didn't go according to plan, but that was a semi-notable free agent signing at the time. Then the draft happens. They get Quay Walker. They get Devontae Wyatt. They trade up for Christian Watson, Sean Ryan, JJ Enagbare, Zach Tom. You guys know the rest of the names, but a very successful draft so far for the Packers. We'll see what that ultimately becomes. I think they still are wanting a little bit more from their first rounders, but can't complain so far with the Dobbs, Watson, Tom, Enagbare portion of the draft, which has been really key. And then even finding some seventh rounders, which are usually nothing, in Tariq Carpenter, core special teams guy, and Samori Toure, who's shown some ability at wide receiver as well. Even undrafted free agency, Coco and Caleb Jones have paid off as well, or at least they're on the 53-man roster. One of them's their long snapper. So a really key weekend for Brian Gutekunst and the Packers at that point. Then Jair Alexander officially signed his contract extension, making him a Green Bay Packer for the foreseeable future. This was about the time where there started to be a little bit more concern over David Bakhtiari and his health and would he be able to play. That was in question, which would stay in question for the foreseeable future. Packers then hosted Man City versus Bayern Munich in a really fun soccer match at Lambeau Field, which it sounds like is going to become something that they do much more often moving forward. I was there. It was phenomenal. The crowd was electric. A really cool atmosphere. Weather didn't totally cooperate. It didn't ruin anything because that game was amazing. From there, we get the news that David Bakhtiari would head to the PUP list. That seemed very non-ideal at the time. It was definitely procedural, but he starts, he goes through the PUP list. He ends up eventually coming back prior to the start of the season, but there was a lot of angst and worry and nervousness about Bakhtiari going on the PUP list at that point. Then the Packers sign, at least it was reported, I think it was Rob Domofsky who had the original report, but that Matt LaFleur, Brian Gutekunst, and Russ Ball were all signed to contract extensions, extending their tenures in Green Bay. Training camp then began, including preseason, the Dream Drive. You had Packers Saints in joint practices, so hope springs eternal that time of year. That was a fun period. I should also note, end of training camp, they award Larry McCarron, 50 years of being a part of the Packers organization, or like at training camp in some capacity, player, reporter, all of it as part of the Packers organization, Packers.com now, I think coach as well. But that was a really cool moment. I wish the fans could have been there for it. Also in the preseason Hall of Fame game, Leroy Butler officially enshrined in Canton, which was an awesome moment. Then end of training camp, David Bakhtiari actually starts practicing. Still wasn't known if he was going to be ready for week 1, but he officially starts practicing. They take him off the PUP list, which was a really first good sign for Bakhtiari in some time. Packers eventually set their 53-man roster, and in doing so, they signed Rudy Ford, who had just been cut by the Jacksonville Jaguars, not Jaguars, Jaguars. So they set their 53-man roster, and like I said, pick up a really key signing in Rudy Ford, who has been a key part of their special teams and then really became a key part of their defense, at least until last week when he was benched and Darnell Savage took his job back seemingly in some capacity. From there, the Packers start the season with a unfortunate loss to the Minnesota Vikings. You've got the Christian Watson drop, and everything was kind of downhill from there. Then everything seemed sort of normal. Packers go on a 3-game winning streak, winning against the Bears, the Buccaneers, and New England. Brian Hoyer started that game. Bailey Zappi came in. Not the most ideal in New England Patriots team, but you still get 3 wins and you're 3-1. Things are looking like, all right, this is your normal Packers season. They're going to go on a win streak. They're easily going to finish in the playoffs. Ho hum, no big deal. Also during that time, lots of good news in the fact that David Bakhtiari made his official return against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, played about half that game. And then Elton Jenkins returned against the Chicago Bears in week 2 and played in that game. So your offensive line was getting healthy. You're 3-1. You kind of put that Vikings loss behind you. And then Packers head to London, play a good first half against the Giants. Look like it's going to be another win. And ultimately really play a horrible second half. They lose to the Giants 27-22. From there, the Packers would lose their next 4 games, which would result in a 5-game losing streak. The first time that the Packers had lost back-to-back regular season games in Matt LaFleur's career. And at the end of that losing streak, they lose Rashawn Gary for the season as well, which was adding injury to insult in that situation. And just everything seemed completely bleak at that moment. Not only are you on a 5-game losing streak, you're 3-6. Rashawn Gary's out for the year. Nothing is going right. And now you've got the Dallas Cowboys and Mike McCarthy coming to town with the ability to really put a complete dagger in the Packers season. Yet somehow Packers find a way to win that game in overtime, beat Mike McCarthy in what was really Christian Watson's coming out game, 3-touchdown game. He would kind of take off from there. After that game, the Packers would release Amari Rodgers and Kylan Hill, officially ending the Amari Rodgers experience. They would ultimately then lose back-to-back games against the Titans and Eagles. And once again, it felt like season over, game over, move on to 2023. But then, out of nowhere, a 3-game win streak. They win against the Bears. They get their bye week. They win against the Baker Mayfield-led LA Rams. And then they get sort of an improbable win in Miami against the Dolphins. After that, they re-sign Elton Jenkins. And that pretty much does it for your recap of the 2022 calendar year, starting with, again, that win against the Minnesota Vikings, ending with kind of a win against the Miami Dolphins, including re-signing Elton Jenkins at the end of that as well. So we've bookended things very well. The middle was extremely tumultuous. You end the year with an 8-10, the calendar year, with an 8-10 record. You had a devastating loss to the 49ers and now sit with about a 25-ish% chance of getting in the playoffs to end this year going into 2023. So a far less than ideal season, a ton of madness, a ton of craziness. Davante traded, Rodgers re-signed, tough losses, all of it is in there, but you're at least ending on a little bit of a high note, 3-game win streak. Your opportunity to make the playoffs for the time being is still there. And now they have another key game coming up with the Minnesota Vikings. That is going to do it for me today. I hope you enjoyed this 2022 year in review, recap, whatever you want to call it. From myself and everyone at the Pack-A-Day podcast, I hope you have a safe and happy new year. I will see you guys in 2023. We will break down the game tomorrow for New Year's Day and Packers-Vikings. Like I said, a very key game. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.